Harry finished reading and looked up at Ron, whose mouth was hanging open. "How did she find out?" he whispered. But that wasn't what was bothering Harry. "What do you mean we all hate Hagrid?" Harry spat at Malfoy. "What's this rubbish about him?" He pointed at Crabbe, getting a bad bite off a flobberworm. "They haven't even got teeth." Crabbe was sniggering, apparently very pleased with himself. "Well, I think this should put an end to the oaf's teaching career," said Malfoy, his eyes glinting. "Half giant. And there was me thinking he'd just swallowed a bottle of Skelligro when he was young. None of the mummies and daddies are going to like this at all. They'll be worried he'll eat all their kids. Ha ha! You! Are you paying attention over there?" Professor Grubblyplank's voice carried over to the boys. The girls were all clustered around the unicorn now, stroking it. Hagrid was so angry that the Daily Prophet article shook in his hands as he turned to stare unseeingly at the unicorn, whose many magical properties Professor Grubblyplank was now enumerating in a loud voice so that the boys could hear too. "I hope she stays, that woman," said Parvati Patil when the lesson had ended and they were all heading back to the castle for lunch. "That's more what I thought care of magical creatures would be like. Proper creatures, like unicorns, not monsters." "What about Hagrid?" Harry said angrily as they went up the steps. "What about him?" said Parvati in a harder voice. "He can still be gamekeeper, can't he?" Parvati had been very cool towards Harry since the ball. He supposed that he ought to have paid her a bit more attention, but she seemed to have had a good time all the same. She was certainly telling anybody who would listen that she had made arrangements to meet the boy from Beauxbatons in Hogsmeade on the next weekend trip. "That was a really good lesson," said Hermione as they entered the Great Hall. "I didn't know half the things Professor Grubblyplank told us about uni—" "Look at this!" Harry snarled, and he shoved the Daily Prophet article under Hermione's nose. Hermione's mouth fell open as she read. Her reaction was exactly the same as Ron's. "How did that horrible Skeeter woman find out? You don't think Hagrid told her?" "No," said Harry, leading the way over to the Gryffindor table and throwing himself into a chair, furious. "He never even told us, did he? I reckon she was so mad he wouldn't give her loads of horrible stuff about me. She went ferreting around to get back at him." "Maybe she heard him telling Madame Maxime at the ball," said Hermione quietly. "We'd have seen her in the garden," said Ron. "Anyway, she's not supposed to come into school anymore, Hagrid said. Dumbledore had banned her." "Maybe she's got an invisibility cloak," said Harry, ladling chicken casserole onto his plate and splashing it everywhere in his anger. "Sort of thing she'd do, isn't it? Hide in bushes, listening to people." "Like you and Ron did, you mean," said Hermione. "We weren't trying to hear him," said Ron indignantly. "We didn't have a choice. The stupid git kept talking about his giantess mother where anyone could have heard him." "We've got to go and see him," said Harry. "This evening, after divination. Tell him we want him back." "You do want him back," he shot at Hermione. Well, I'm not going to pretend it didn't make a nice change having a proper care of magical creatures lesson for once, but I do want Hagrid back. Of course I do," Hermione added hastily, quailing under Harry's furious stare. So that evening, after dinner, the three of them left the castle once more and went down through the frozen grounds to Hagrid's cabin. They knocked, and Fang's booming barks answered. "Hagrid, it's us!" Harry shouted, pounding on the door. "Open up!" He didn't answer. They could hear Fang scratching at the door, whining, but it didn't open. They hammered on it for 10 more minutes. Ron even went and banged on one of the windows, but there was no response. "What's he avoiding us for?" Hermione said, when they had finally given up and were walking back to the castle. "He surely doesn't think we'd care about him being half giant." But it seemed that Hagrid did care. They didn't see a sign of him all week. He didn't appear at the staff table at mealtimes. They didn't see him going about his gamekeeper duties in the grounds, and Professor Grubblyplank continued to take the care of magical creatures classes. Malfoy was gloating at every possible opportunity. "Missing your half-breed pal?" he kept whispering to Harry whenever there was a teacher around, so that he was safe from Harry's retaliation. "Missing the elephant man?" There was a Hogsmeade visit halfway through January. Hermione was very surprised that Harry was planning to go. "I just thought you'd want to take advantage of the common room being quiet," she said. "Really get to work on that egg." "Oh, I reckon I've got a pretty good idea what it's about now," Harry lied. "Have you really?" said Hermione, looking impressed. "Well done." Harry's insides gave a guilty squirm, but he ignored them. He still had 5 weeks to work out that egg clue after all, and that was ages. And if he went into Hogsmeade, he might run into Hagrid and get a chance to persuade him to come back. He, Ron and Hermione left the castle together on Saturday and set off through the cold, wet grounds towards the gates. As they passed the Durmstrang ship moored in the lake, they saw Victor Crumb emerge onto the deck, dressed in nothing but swimming trunks. He was very skinny, but apparently a lot tougher than he looked, because he climbed up onto the side of the ship, stretched out his arms, and dived right into the lake. "He's mad," said Harry, staring at Crumb's dark head as it bobbed out into the middle of the lake. "It must be freezing. It's January." "It's a lot colder where he comes from," said Hermione. "I suppose it feels quite warm to him." "Yeah, but there's still the giant squid," said Ron. He didn't sound anxious. If anything, he sounded hopeful. Hermione noticed his tone of voice and frowned. "He's really nice, you know," she said. "He's not at all like you'd think, coming from Durmstrang. He likes it much better here, he told me." Ron said nothing. He hadn't mentioned Victor Crumb since the ball, but Harry had found a miniature arm under his bed on Boxing Day, which had looked very much as though it had been snapped off a small model figure wearing Bulgaria Quidditch robes. Harry kept his eyes skinned for a sign of Hagrid all the way down the slushy high street, and suggested a visit to the Three Broomsticks once he had ascertained that Hagrid was not in any of the shops. The pub was as crowded as ever, but one quick look around at all the tables told Harry that Hagrid wasn't there. Heart sinking, he went up to the bar with Ron and Hermione, ordered 3 butterbeers from Madame Rismerta, and thought gloomily that he might just as well have stayed behind and listened to the egg wailing after all. "Doesn't he ever go into the office?" Hermione whispered suddenly. "Look." She pointed into the mirror behind the bar, and Harry saw Ludo Bagman reflected there, sitting in a shadowy corner with a bunch of goblins. Bagman was talking very fast in a low voice to the goblins, all of whom had their arms crossed and were looking rather menacing. It was indeed odd, Harry thought, that Bagman was here at the Three Broomsticks on a weekend when there was no Triwizard event, and therefore no judging to be done. He watched Bagman in the mirror. He was looking strained again, quite as strained as he had done that night in the forest before the dark marker had appeared. But just then Bagman glanced over at the bar, saw Harry, and stood up. In a moment, Harry heard him say brusquely to the goblins, and Bagman hurried through the pub towards Harry, his boyish grin back in place. "Harry," he said, "how are you? Been hoping to run into you. Everything going all right?" "Fine, thanks," said Harry. "Wonder if I could have a quick private word, Harry," said Bagman eagerly. "You couldn't give us a moment, you two, could you?" Okay," said Ron, and he and Hermione went off to find a table. Bagman led Harry along the bar to the end furthest from Madame Rismerta. "Well, I just thought I'd congratulate you again on your splendid performance against that Horntail, Harry," said Bagman. "Really superb." "Thanks," said Harry, but he knew this couldn't be all that Bagman wanted to say, because he could have congratulated Harry in front of Ron and Hermione. Bagman didn't seem in any particular rush to spill the beans, though. Harry saw him glance into the mirror over the bar at the goblins, who were all watching him and Harry in silence through their dark, slanting eyes. "Absolute nightmare," said Bagman to Harry in an undertone, noticing Harry watching the goblins too. "Their English isn't too good. It's like being back with all the Bulgarians at the Quidditch World Cup. But at least they use signed language. Another human could recognise. This lot keep gabbling in gobbledygook, and I only know one word of gobbledygook. Ladvac. It means pickaxe. I don't like to use it in case they think I'm threatening them." He gave a short, booming laugh. What do they want?" Harry said, noticing how the goblins were still watching Bagman very closely. Well," said Bagman, suddenly looking nervous. They're looking for Barty Crouch." "Why are they looking for him here?" said Harry. "He's at the Ministry in London, isn't he?" As a matter of fact, I've no idea where he is," said Bagman. "He sort of stopped coming to work. Been absent for a couple of weeks now. Young Percy, his assistant, says he's ill. Apparently he's just been sending instructions by owl. Would you mind not mentioning that to anyone, Harry? Because Rita Skeeter's still poking around everywhere she can, and I'm willing to bet she'd worked Barty's illness up into something sinister. Probably say he's gone missing like Bertha Jorkins." Have you heard anything about Bertha Jorkins? Harry asked. No, said Bagman, looking strained again. I've got people looking, of course. About time, thought Harry. And it's all very strange. She definitely arrived in Albania because she met her second cousin there, and then she left the cousin's house to go south and see an aunt. And she seems to have vanished without trace en route. Blowed if I can see where she's got to. She doesn't seem the type to elope, for instance. But still, what are we doing, talking about goblins and Bertha Jorkins? I really want to ask you, he said, lowering his voice. How are you getting on with your golden egg? Not bad, Harry said untruthfully. Bagman seemed to know he wasn't being honest. Listen, Harry, he said, still in a very low voice. I feel very bad about all this. You were thrown into this tournament. You didn't volunteer for it. And if... His voice was so quiet now, Harry had to lean closer to listen. If I can help at all, a nod in the right direction, I've taken a liking to you, the way you got past that dragon. Well, just say the word. Harry looked up into Bagman's round, rosy face and wide baby blue eyes. We're supposed to work out the clues alone, aren't we? He said, careful to keep his voice casual and not sound as though he was accusing the head of the Department of Magical Games and Sports of breaking the rules. Well, yes, said Bagman impatiently. But come on, Harry, we all want a Hogwarts victory, don't we? Have you offered Cedric help? Harry said. The smallest of frowns creased Bagman's smooth face. No, I haven't, he said. Like I say, I've taken a liking to you. Just thought I'd offer. Well, thanks, said Harry, but I think I'm nearly there with that egg. A couple more days should crack it. He wasn't entirely sure why he was refusing Bagman's help, except that Bagman was almost a stranger to him, and accepting his assistance would feel somehow much more like cheating than asking advice from Ron, Hermione, or Sirius. Bagman looked almost affronted, but couldn't say much more as Fred and George turned up at that point. Hello, Mr. Bagman, said Fred brightly. Can we buy you a drink? No, said Bagman with a last disappointed glance at Harry. No, thank you, boys. Fred and George looked quite as disappointed as Bagman, who was surveying Harry as though he had let him down badly. Well, I must dash, he said. Nice seeing you all. Good luck, Harry. He hurried out of the pub. Goblins all slid off their chairs and exited after him. Harry went to rejoin Ron and Hermione. What did he want? Ron said the moment Harry sat down. He offered to help me with the golden egg, said Harry. He shouldn't be doing that, said Hermione, looking very shocked. He's one of the judges. And anyway, you've already worked it out, haven't you? Nearly, said Harry. Well, I don't think Dumbledore would like it if he knew Bagman was trying to persuade you to cheat, said Hermione, still looking deeply disapproving. I hope he's trying to help Cedric as much. He's not, I asked, said Harry. Who cares if Diggory's getting help, said Ron. Harry privately agreed. Those goblins didn't look very friendly, said Hermione, sipping her butterbeer. What were they doing here? Looking for Crouch, according to Bagman, said Harry. He's still ill, hasn't been into work. Maybe Percy's poisoning him, said Ron. Probably thinks if Crouch snuffs it, he'll be made head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Hermione gave Ron a don't joke about things like that look and said, Funny, goblins looking for Mr. Crouch. They'd normally deal with the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. Crouch can speak loads of different languages, though, said Harry. Maybe they need an interpreter. Worrying about poor ickle goblins now, are you? Ron asked Hermione. Thinking of starting up SPUG or something? Society for the Protection of Ugly Goblins? Ha ha ha, said Hermione sarcastically. Goblins don't need protection. Haven't you been listening to what Professor Binns has been telling us about goblin rebellions? No, said Harry and Ron together. Well, they're quite capable of dealing with wizards, said Hermione, sipping more butterbeer. They're very clever. They're not like house elves who never stick up for themselves. Uh-oh, said Ron, staring at the door. Rita Skeeter had just entered. She was wearing banana yellow robes today. Her long nails were painted shocking pink, and she was accompanied by her paunchy photographer. She bought drinks, and she and the photographer made their way through the crowds to a table nearby. Harry, Ron, and Hermione glaring at her as she approached. She was talking fast and looking very satisfied about something. Didn't seem very keen to talk to us, did he, bozo? Now, why would that be, do you think? And what's he doing with a pack of goblins in tow, anyway? Showing them the sights? What nonsense! He was always a bad liar. Reckon something's up.